Matthew chapter 28. Then the 11 disciples went away into Galilee, to the mountain which Jesus had appointed for them. Verse 17 says, when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. So in the context of worshiping Jesus, Scripture suggests that there are some doubters. Verse 18 says, and Jesus came and spoke to him, saying, all authority, maybe your translation says all power, has been given to me in heaven and on earth. It seems like the Christmas season has come and gone so fast. Maybe some of us have the remnants of decorations or poinsettias or wrapping paper around the house, but if you look around, even in the stores have forgotten. All that stuff we were scraping and trying and working extra to buy for Christmas, the next day was 75% off. Christmas decorations now at rock bottom. It seems that the rest of the world has just forgotten that story that we tell so many times. You will find the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in the manger. All the mangers have been packed up. All the hay is gone. All the nativity animals are returned to where you rented them from. We put the costumes of the shepherds and angels back in the box, and we'll bring them out about this time or a little bit earlier next year. We have forgotten the story already. As we key in on Matthew's gospel starts with the understanding that he wants you to understand that Jesus is king. Remember now, Matthew is writing to Jews, and the Jews are skeptical, because they've seen Jesus walk and they've seen Jesus act, and some of them are not convinced that Jesus is the Messiah. After all Jesus has done for you, some of us are still not convinced that Jesus is the Messiah. So Matthew is trying to craft his gospel, and he starts his gospel with the story, the nativity story and the Christmas story and the holiday story. But by the time we get down to the end of Matthew's gospel, Matthew wants you to be sure without a shadow of a doubt that this is not just a regular dude who was born in the ghetto. We talked about it during our Christmas sermon. Nazareth was not a nice place. It was not a place that you went to hang out. It was a place that people thought less than. The disciples even asked when Jesus starts walking around, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? But by the time Matthew finishes his gospel, he finishes not with the words of a poor person, not with the words of an average person or a common working man or a carpenter. He finishes the book of Matthew with the words of a king. All power is given to me. As I'm reading this story, and can you imagine being in the context where you're hearing this for the first time? Back when this was written, there were not Bibles around. We got Bibles in the pews. We got Bibles on iPads. We got Bibles on iPhones. We got Bibles everywhere. You go in the hotel room, there's a Bible. Bibles just fall out of everywhere. But this wasn't the case here. You had maybe one or two or a few copies. So most of the time what they would do, they would gather the people for church. And what they would do was simply read. One person would simply read the words of the gospel. And can you imagine hearing this story for the first time? It would take them a couple of hours to read from the whole. There were no chapter divisions at that time. It would take them a couple of hours to read through the whole thing, stopping and emphasizing certain points. And as you read this story, you realize coming to the end, especially hearing it the first time, that there are some problems with this story. And the problem is not with Jesus. The problem in the story comes from the context of the other characters. Matthew chapter 28, verse 1 reads this way. Now after the Sabbath, as the dawn of the first day of the week began to dawn, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb. There are women there on the third day. And if I'm hearing this story the first time, I realize that it's good for the women to be there, but there's a problem. If you would have expected anybody to be at the tomb on the third day, how many times did Jesus, in repeating to his disciples, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up? They got the privilege of understanding the deep things and the intimate things of God. When Jesus talked to the crowds, he talked in stories, he talked in parables. Sometimes he talked in riddles, but when he chopped it up with his disciples, it was plain. He told the truth straight. He hid nothing from them. If you expected anybody to be at the tomb on the third day, you would have expected to see the disciples. But there are no disciples there. And in our modern day church, we suffer from the same predicament. Because mama knows the truth. And grandmama knows the truth. And auntie holds on to the truth. But we have been convinced that somewhere in our modern makeup that there is something not manly about following Jesus. We're convinced that church is a place and worshiping God is a place for people who are soft, for people who are not men, for people who cannot stand up for themselves, for people who don't have pride. But when I read the stories of the Bible, I know that that's a lie. You can't tell me David wasn't a man facing Goliath, facing the armies of the Philistines, having 300 armed soldiers to do his very bidding. You can't tell me that David was not a man. You can't tell me that Moses was not a man. Kill somebody in Egypt. But then God straightened some things out, and then he was so much of a man that he could go to the highest authority in the land and stand that person face to face and say, let God's people go. You can't tell me Christianity is not for men, because it is. But we see in this story and in our lives and in our churches the predicament that we suffer from a lack of men. The women are there. The angel says to the women the words that he should have said to the disciples the first time. Go quickly and tell his disciples he is risen from the dead. Verse 7 says, and indeed he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him. Behold, I have told you. I'm glad some of us are not Jesus. Even though sometimes in our lives we pretend to take on that role. Be glad that we are not Jesus. And the truth is, when we look at this story and when we look at what Jesus is about to do, had we been looking from the outside, we would have had a problem with the way that Jesus sets up this ministry. Let's read the verse again. Verse 16 says, then the 11 disciples went away into Galilee. That's a problem text. And the problem is every time you hear the word disciple, well, at least for the most part in the New Testament, you associate it with the number 12. We even would sing the songs as little children. Jesus had 12 disciples that he had called to help him. When he's moving and when he's living his life and when he's doing these great things, we associate that with the number 12. But the scripture says there are not 12 disciples. There are only 11. What's the nugget in the story? The same people you start your Christian journey with will not always be the same people you end it with. We talked about the fact that even in our church, there are some people who have heard the gospel, who have been integral figures, not just in our Christian church, but integral figures in this specific church, and we're crying out and we're praying and we're waiting and our arms are open wide. We're saying, come back and fellowship with us. But the truth is, everybody ain't coming back. Now, that's hard to say, but it's reality. As Jesus is giving the message, only 11 show up. Those of us who are counting said it really should have only been 10. After the way that Peter conducted himself, he is not fit. He is not qualified. He is not worthy. But he calls them anyway. Here's the first thing I want us to consider. The fact that in his ministry, not just when Jesus was on earth, but in 2013, Jesus is willing to use people who have deserted him. So let's set the scenario. When Jesus called these men, what he called them to was always greater than what he called them from. So the work that God is calling you to, even if you had to leave something of importance, the work that he's calling you to is always greater than the place where he called you from. Let's take Peter and his brother Andrew. Let's take James and his brother John. I've told you before, but I'll explain to you the situation again. They are in the boats when Jesus calls them. They're at home living with mama when Jesus calls them. There's no other way to there's no other way to put it. In this society, you put in your invitation to follow a rabbi. Because if there were wandering teachers around, you found one that you thought had something going, and you approached that rabbi and said, this is what I've studied. This is how much scripture I learned. This is how much I understand. Can I follow you? And if the rabbi says, no, you can't follow me, you need to go home. You need to move back home. So can you understand the scenario here? You have tried as best you could to get some things going in your life, but they have not worked out the way that you've wanted them to. And because they have not, you end up going back home. The problem is not that they are at home. The problem is that they have to see some of the very same people who they went to school with doing better things than they're doing. I tell everybody, I graduated after my class in college. So that feeling of the same people that I started freshman year with, I'm still struggling to get through classes because of some decisions that I make. And I'm seeing them go on and start families and have jobs and get important positions. And I'm stuck because I'm realizing I made some bad decisions, so I'm still in this place. Because things don't shake out, Andrew and Peter and James and John have to deal with the embarrassment of still being at home. But when Jesus shows up, he takes the paradigm and turns it on his ear. No longer do they have to apply to the rabbi himself shows up. And the rabbi says, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. Instantly, Jesus shows up and gives their life credibility and importance and value and mission. If anybody should have been at the tomb on the third day, should have been those disciples. But they were not. Or maybe Matthew, the very author of this gospel, he himself was not there. Matthew is a different story. Because Matthew is the story of the church boy who knew better. Matthew grows up in Jewish tradition. Matthew has to memorize scripture. Matthew is intellectually qualified to be a student of a rabbi. But Matthew takes his gifts and his talents and his abilities and he uses them for himself. He becomes a traitor to his own people. He is a tax collector for the Roman government. And the Roman government says, listen, as long as you collect the taxes and we get our share, we don't care how much you charge the people. The boy knows better. And how many of us in our own spiritual experience are in situations that we know better? But you see the problem in the story. That Jesus calls those who deserted him. Matthew chapter 26, Peter, big mouth Peter, stands up and says, Jesus, even if I have to die. Don't we say some dumb stuff sometimes? We say some dumb stuff, even in our prayers. Something we heard in a song and we think it sounds good. We'll say that in our prayer. And God said, okay, that's how you feel? Let's try it out. Even if we have to die, I will not deny you. We put all the emphasis on Peter, but Matthew 26 says, all the disciples said the same thing. But when the heat got turned up just enough, oh man, let's get personal. Let's get real personal. Let's do the context of some of our relationships. Sometimes we throw around that four-letter word like it's just easy to throw around. I love you, and I'm going to stick with you, and I'm going to be with you. And whatever the top popular R&B love song, we send that in text message to the person that we're with. But let the situation get uncomfortable. Once the situation gets uncomfortable, we start to say, well, what I meant was. I didn't really mean that I love you like that, but I got love for you. Matter of fact, it's not even you, it's me. When the heat of the situation turns up just enough, we find that when Jesus is arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, Matthew chapter 26 tells us that every single last one of those jokers left Jesus. They all forsook him and fled, and they said, I will never leave you. I've said that to Jesus a couple times. I'll never leave you, Jesus. Said it as a little boy, said it as a teenager, said it as a young man. Now I'm in my early 30s, and you think of how many times where you've made that declaration that you will never leave Jesus. And then something happens to cause you to compromise. And you have to make a decision. Do I stick it out with Jesus even though this situation is uncomfortable? Or do I forsake him and flee like the rest of his disciples? The truth is, God called. Jesus is willing. Jesus is willing to entrust the mission of his church. Jesus is willing to entrust the mission of Christianity. Jesus is willing to entrust the mission of Cottage Chapel Seventh-day Adventist Church to people who have deserted him. But it doesn't stop there. It says in the next verse, verse 17, and when they saw him, in the middle of their worship of Jesus, some of them doubted. Jesus is right there. Jesus is right there. They saw him on the cross. They saw him arrested. They saw him being beat. They saw him on the cross. They saw them take down his dead body. And now they're face to face with Jesus. But Matthew records, because he is a part of this group, some of us got some doubts about Jesus. Let's back up in the story a little bit. It says that Jesus' words to them, I'll meet you in Galilee. Now, when Jesus dies, he's right outside of Jerusalem. The disciples are there too. He says, I'll meet you in Galilee. From Jerusalem to Galilee is about 80, 90 miles. There are no Greyhound buses. These gentlemen are poor, so there are no camels. There is nothing but their 2 feet. And on average, you walk about 30 miles a day. So it's going to take you about 3 days to get to Galilee. Now, after walking to Galilee, it's funny because Galilee is the headquarters for the ministry of Jesus while he is on earth. Most of his miracles were in and around Galilee. When he calls his disciples, Galilee. Water into wine, Galilee. Feeding the 5,000, yeah, that was Galilee too. Calming the storm, Galilee. Walking on water, Sea of Galilee. Greatest sermon, Galilee. So as they're walking back to Galilee, they can't help but remember everything that Jesus has done. I remember that was the place where I was standing when he healed the blind man. I remember when I was handing out the food, this little girl was tugging on my leg because she wanted some more. I remember that night when we were out of our mind because the storm was raging. I remember that's where the boat was parked. As they're walking back to Galilee, they can't help but remember what Jesus has done in their life. But even after remembering all that, they get to the point where they're worshiping, and it says Some of them still doubt. Some of them are still not sure. And the question is, what's it going to take? What's it going to take for some of us? Remember, Jesus is on the cross, and the Jewish leaders come to the cross and say, show us another sign. Come down from the cross, and we will believe you. What's it really going to take? Some of them are doubting. It's funny that Jesus meets the disciples back in Galilee. And he meets them in the very same place. He meets them in the very same state as they were when he first asked them to call him. When Jesus first shows up to these men, they're embarrassed because they're at home and they're not following a great teacher. When Jesus shows up now, they're embarrassed because their teacher has died. When Jesus shows up the first time, they don't have a mission or purpose for their life. And now, since Jesus has died and he's reappearing to them, they're trying to figure out what their mission and purpose are once again. And isn't it funny how Jesus will go back and meet you at the very same place he called you from? Jesus is not scared of your addiction. Jesus is not bothered by your family situation. Jesus is not impressed by your education, or he is not discouraged by your lack thereof. He will meet you at the very same spot where he called you the first time. So even in my doubt of Jesus, if I run back to the same situation that he called me from, he will show up right there. Meets them in the same situation. A different gospel puts it this way: when Jesus shows up the second time, we don't just find Peter despondent. We find Peter going back to his old way of life. He's fishing once again. Jesus says, you ain't got to fish no more. That's not your job. That's not your responsibility. That's not your life. And sometimes when we follow Jesus and we slip up, we try to force ourselves back into an outfit that Jesus told us not to wear anymore. They're still doubting. They've deserted Jesus. But now Jesus is about to do something crazy. He says, when he shows up, he does not say, I told you so. That's what we do sometimes. Somebody comes into our fellowship, or comes into Christianity, or comes into our church, and they have a struggle, and we know their story, and we know what they're trying to work out. And when they make a mistake, some of us will say, see, I told you. I know they just came. They just came for the concert. They weren't going to be here that long. They just came for the revival. They weren't going. They just came for potluck. They weren't going to be here that long. But when Jesus shows up, Jesus does not say, I told you so. What's the answer to your doubt? What's the answer to your discouragement? What's the answer to your desertion of Jesus? Jesus' statement, all power. But Jesus, when I was at school and we were sitting around the cafeteria table and somebody asked, did I believe in God? And everybody looked at me because I knew I went to church. I said, no, I denied you. Jesus says, all power. But Jesus, you don't know where I came from. You don't know my family situation. We got some not only rotten apples, we got some rotten branches on our family tree. Jesus says, all power. Well, Jesus, you know that time where I'm stuck between, I got paid on Friday, and I'm debating between, should I really return an honest tithe and offering, or should I really pay for something that I really need in my house? I got heat, and I got lights, and I got groceries that I need, and I made the decision to pay for those things instead of giving back to you what you deserve. Jesus says, that's okay, because I still got all power in my hands. And the fact is, God's mission is only limited by the things that you will not submit to Jesus' power. God's mission, the mission of the church, is only limited by the things that you are unwilling to submit to God's power. So this is the Great Commission. Don't want to keep you too much longer. This is the Great Commission. Let's read it together. Listen, Matthew chapter 28, verse 18. And Jesus came and spoke to them, saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations. Why would Jesus tell them to go make disciples? What qualified? They are not qualified to make disciples. Do you know in the Roman army, because they lived under Roman rule, if you deserted your post in time of war, there were severe penalties to pay. So in the time of Jesus' greatest need, in the time of Jesus' greatest spiritual battle, when he needed his soldiers, they were not. In the Roman army, if you desert your post in time of war, they do about 4 or 5 things. One, they'll take you outside and stone you. Drop a big, huge stone on your chest so you'll fall, and everybody just start throwing rocks at your head until you die. Or they'll beat you with rods until you die. Or if they want to be especially cruel to you, they'll beat or whip the soles of your feet with canes. So every time you try to walk, you're reminded that you deserted your post. Or if they wanted to be especially cruel to you, they banished you so that you had no contact with anybody else. But when Jesus shows up, he does not remind them that they left him high and dry. He says, I need you to go on a mission. Go and make disciples. Baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teach them to observe all things that I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you. 3 points, and I'll sit down. First one is you have to go. Everybody say go. The truth is that you cannot stay where you are. There is nothing about being a disciple of Jesus that allows you to stay where you are. Matthew chapter 4 tells us that when Jesus was teaching and healing people, when he moved, they sent crowds of people to him. People who were dealing, what does it say, with diseases and torments and demon-possessed and epileptics and paralytics, and he healed them all. We see inside of this the messiness of following Jesus. We try to make Christianity so cute and so clean, but it's not. We think, elder, that if we can just dress people up the right way, if I can get you the right tie, get you some Stacey Adams or some Aldos. There's a store in the mall in Bowling Green that sells suits for cheap. If I can get you inside of the right suit and clean you up, then I can make a disciple out of you. But that's not Christianity. Christianity is messy. So Jesus goes out in Matthew chapter 4. In Matthew chapter 10, he sends out his disciples. He says to his disciples, heal the sick, cleanse lepers, cast out demons, preach the gospel. The same messiness that Jesus had to deal with when he was preaching is the same messiness that his disciples have to deal with when they're carrying the gospel. What does that mean? That we have to be willing to allow in our church people who are not as cleaned up as we would like them to be. We have to be willing to allow in our church people who suffer from addictions. We have to be willing to allow in our church people with severe family issues and, dare I say, even abuse. We have to be willing to allow in our church simply people that just got bad attitudes. We got to be willing to deal with people who have emotional baggage. There is nothing like emotional baggage. Let me explain to you what emotional baggage is. Emotional baggage is this. When I make reference to when I make reference to God as Heavenly Father, if you've not had a good relationship with your Father, every time I say the word Father, something happens inside of your brain. It makes you uncomfortable. That's emotional baggage. But we have to be willing to allow those people in our church. We just got to be willing to allow people in our church who are not committed to the gospel the same way that we are. Because that's what Jesus did. But you can't sit here and do it. You have to go. You have to move. So that means in the vision of our church, what does that look like for us? Besides being here on Sabbath morning, what are the places that we have to go to? We need to begin to identify the neighborhoods that we need to have a presence in. We need to begin to identify the schools in which we need to have a presence in. We need to begin to identify the homes and families where we're willing to get messy enough to tell somebody about Jesus. He first says do, and he first says go, and then he says do. Everybody say do. Yes. This is the definition of what it means to be a disciple. A disciple literally means one who follows after another. So in that context, Jesus, how do I make disciples? Well, if a disciple is one who follows after another, then you need to live your life as one who's following after Jesus. You need to live your life in such a way that when people look at you, they realize that something is different. Now, different doesn't mean weird. We don't have to be weird, but we do have to be different. So different means that we handle our finances a different way. Being different means that we do health a different way. Being different means we handle our education a different way. We're serious as a child of God. As I am in school, I'm not cutting up and acting a fool. I know the privilege that I have, and I'm going to set an example, even if everybody else makes fun of me, because I'm not concerned about them making fun of me. I'm concerned about what God thinks about me. We need to begin to live our lives with changed priorities. And that's the struggle for most of us, honestly. We've signed on to follow Jesus, but we have not changed our priorities. One of the disciples comes to Jesus, one of his followers, and said, Jesus, I want to follow you, but allow me to bury my dead relative. And Jesus says, let the dead bury their own. Now, when you hear that, you're like, man, Jesus, that's kind of harsh. This is Jewish burial customs. You bury somebody in a tomb. You wait a year for their body to decompose. You open the tomb, take out the bones, have another service, and put them into a special box, and put that box back inside the tomb. So the disciple was saying, Jesus, I want to follow you, but give me a year. Jesus, I want to follow you, but give me some more time. Jesus saying, if you need all that time, I can't do nothing with you. Because the longer you wait, the more things will get in the way. What do some of us say? Jesus, I'll follow you after I graduate from high school. I got you. Okay, Jesus, I'll follow you after. Let me go to college first and get my degree. Okay, Jesus, you know what? Man, I'm alone. I really need to get married. So let me get married. Let me get some things done that I want to, and then I'll follow you. Okay, Jesus, let me have children first, okay? I'll commit my life to you after I have children. Okay, Jesus, the job I'm working at right now isn't really the job I want to be at. So let me climb the corporate ladder or do some different things, and some of us are honest. We made the wholehearted decision to follow Jesus totally in the later part of our life, when the strength of our youth was what Jesus wanted first. Oh, don't get me wrong. He takes you. If you're 9 or 90, Jesus will take you. But he's saying, I want you. He called the disciples. These were teenagers. Give me your strength now, young people. Don't waste it on the foolishness. Don't waste it on the guy that don't love you. He's just trying to get some. Don't waste it on the girl that don't love you. She knows she's attracted to God's blessing on your life. And if you mingle with a person long enough, the blessing of God will leave. And I guarantee you, so will that person. So you can't stay the same, and you got to live your life differently. He first says, go, and then he says, do. And the last thing that Jesus says is say. He says, teach them everything that I taught you. And the problem is, some of us want to be spokespersons for Jesus, But we don't know what Jesus said. We can sound spiritual. It's easy to sound spiritual and not be biblical. There's some stuff that common sayings that we think are in the Bible that are not anywhere close to the Bible. He says, teach them everything that I have taught you. Every word, not just the part of my gospel that makes you feel comfortable. The hard sayings. Remember that Jesus said, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you will have no part of me. And when he made that statement, some of the disciples left him and did not follow him anymore. The gospel is hard to deal with. Yes, it's powerful, and yes, it's a life-saving truth, but the truth of the matter is, when we come face to face with the gospel, we must realize that God is calling us to change some stuff about our lives. He said, if the way that you were living your life was okay, then you wouldn't have needed me to show up. But because it's a mess, and because you want me to fix it, you got to know what I say. And not only do you have to know what I say, you got to be willing to say it to everybody around you. I'm from Detroit, and I like to say I'm from Detroit. My favorite basketball team is this. My favorite football team is this. This is my favorite food. This is my favorite restaurant on Scottsville Road. This is my favorite television show on TV. And I'll tell you the whole show, but ask me something about Jesus. And I run out of words. I run out of words to say. So in 2013, these are the things that our church will be focused on. We focused on going. We got to get up out of these pews. We got to get up out of these pews. The pews will be here if we're not here. And even if they are not here, that doesn't matter. We got to go. But we can't just show up. Because the worst volunteer is the volunteer that shows up but doesn't do anything. Didn't you come to help? No, I just come to kind of supervise. I come to observe. I come to eat. But I didn't come to help. Jesus said, I just don't need you to be active in going. I need you to do something too. And everybody's not called to do the same role. Let's be honest. Some of us, if I handed you the microphone and asked you to stand up here and say something, you'd faint. You would fall flat out. But Jesus says, okay, I've gifted. The reason why I have to bring you unconventional group of people together is the fact that all of you don't have the same gifts. Let me sit down and try to play the piano. Yeah, we'll clear the church then. Some of you have gifts. Some of you are great. Vernisha cooks and she makes cakes. Ron is good with construction and technology. Everybody has something that they can do. But the problem is if you're here and you're not doing anything. So we have to move from just being members of a church to being disciples of Jesus. And the disciples of Jesus go and do and say. That's the sermon. Nothing heavy, nothing deep, not trying to be theological. Not trying to make you cry or make you think, man, that was awesome. No, we need to go, we need to do, and we need to say. And if we want our community to hear the gospel, that's what we have to do. We can sit here for the next 52 Sabbaths in a row and impact nobody. If you want to. But that's not what Jesus called us to do.